The holiday that we now know as Labor Day grew out of the labor movements of the late 19th century. It was about that time that the late President Grover Cleveland declared it a national holiday. Most people think that he was doing it in order to save face after a strike that was somewhat mishandled. So I thought this morning, since we're between sermon series and Labor Day's tomorrow, why don't we think a little bit about the topic of work? Not just labor or what the labor movement was about, but broadly about work. And I want to start with this question. What is the story that you tell yourself in regard to your work? What is the story that you tell yourself in regard to your work? Now, what I am trying to get at by that question may not be initially evident. So I'm going to use an illustration that was originally given by Alistair McIntyre and is often used by Tim Keller when he's addressing this relationship between our faith and our work. And the illustration goes like this. Say one day that you're standing at a bus stop, and a young man who you have never ever met before comes up to you and says, the common name of the wild duck is Histrionicus, Histrionicus, Histrionicus. Now at that moment, you have to decide how to make sense of this situation. You have to put the situation into some type of story. So, you might say to yourself, well, this person must be mentally ill. That's the reason why this young man who I have never ever met before came to me saying that the Latin name of a wild duck is Histrionicus, Histrionicus, Histrionicus. That would be one possibility. It would make sense of the situation. Another possibility is this. Maybe this young man was at the library yesterday and he ran into someone who kind of had my appearance, my stature, someone who resembled me, and that person asked him, what is the Latin name of the wild duck? And he couldn't think of the answer at the time. So he sees you at the bus stop and he thinks you're that person that asked him that question at the library, and he comes up to you and he says, oh yeah, the name of the common wild duck is Histrionicus, Histrionicus, Histrionicus. That would make sense of it. Or what if you said, you know what? What if this young man is a foreign spy who has come to a prearranged rendezvous point, and he has used this ill-chosen code word to draw attention to his counterpart? Now, each of those stories would help you make sense of this situation. But the story that you tell yourself will determine your next action. Maybe you'll kill the guy. I mean, he's a foreign spy. He might be here to assassinate someone. You're stopping an assassination. Maybe he's mentally ill, and, well, that would be a shame that these things happen. You know. Maybe you'll engage him into some type of conversation, or maybe you'll say, oh, you've mistaken me for somebody else. But whatever you do next is going to be shaped by the story that you tell yourself about this young man who has approached you at a bus stop, this young man you've never met before who said, the common name of the wild duck is Histrionicus, Histrionicus, Histrionicus. If we do not know what type of story to put our work into, our work will be meaningless. So what type of story can we put our work into? Well, I want to give you a scriptural story to put your work into. And if you have your Bible, I'd invite you to turn to the very beginning, Genesis chapter 1. And we're going to be looking at that first chapter in the book of Genesis. If you're using the Pew Bible, it's going to be, we're actually going to be turning to page 3. And we're going to be going to verse 26. So chapter 1 of Genesis, verse 26. Chapter 3 in your pew Bible. About midway down the first column. This is what we read in verse 26. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, in our likeness." You could spend your entire life reading all of the literature that has been written over the centuries about the image of God, and you would have barely scratched the surface of that body of literature. So what can we really know about this concept that's called the image of God? Well, the first thing is this. Out of all God's creation, the only creature that is called the image of God is humankind. It's the only creature. So there's something unique about being made in the image of God. The second thing is this, is that Hebrew word that we translate image is oftentimes used of statues. And that, it kind of gives the indication that it represents something. So in some way, by image of God, what we mean is that in some way we represent God in this world. But to be made in his image, to be made in his likeness, also implies that in some way we share certain characteristics with God. And that's where things get a little dicey and people begin to disagree on what those characteristics are. However, we're going to just look at the context here in chapter 1 and see what we can find out about this image of God, what it means. What are these characteristics that we in some way share with God? So verse 26, let us make man in our image, in our likeness. And then it says this, and let them rule over. All right, take that verb, rule over, put it in your pocket, hold on to it. We're going to get back to it. Let them rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air, over the livestock, over all the earth, and over all the creatures that move along the ground. And then verse 27 says that God did. He created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him, male and female he created them. And then it says this in verse 28, God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful. Take that word, be fruitful. Put that in your pocket. Hold on to it for a little bit. And increase in number. Fill the earth and subdue it. I'm going to ask you to put that word in your pocket too. It'll fit, trust me. Rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air. There's that word rule over. And over every living creature that moves on the ground. Rule over. Well, certainly God rules over all of creation, all of the universe, and everything that has ever been. He rules over it. All right, so somehow we share in God's rulership over creation. Be fruitful and multiply. Well, what has God been doing for the last 5? He's now on the 6th day. He's been filling the earth with his creation. So in some way, multiplying, we are filling the earth with God's creation. Subdue. Is that not what God does with the entire creation, with his mission, with his plan, with his redemptive plan? He's subduing all of creation. In some way, we share in those qualities of God of ruling over, of being fruitful, multiplying, and subduing the world. In some way, we share them. Now, if you would have asked me before this week how I would define these terms, rule over, which is sometimes translated dominion, and subdue, I probably would say, well, basically it captures the idea of stewardship. And if you ask me today, I would say the same thing, but I would also say that it means so much more. Usually when we think of stewardship, we kind of think of trustee. Like, okay, I take care of what has been entrusted to me. I protect it. I keep it well. I try to make sure nothing happens to it. I try to do good with it. I'm just entrusted with it. But I think what God has in mind here means so much more than just keeping something safe and protected. Let's say that you had a lump of clay, and you took that lump of clay to the local potter, and you said, "Here, I want you to steward this lump of clay." And let's say that this potter, he knew it was clay, kept the clay moist, kept it from drying out. He put it in a safe place so no one would come in and steal the clay. But he also knew, he didn't want to make it too moist. I mean, things might start growing on it. I don't know what grows on clay. Thing could end up growing. I'm starting to lose my microphone, aren't I? Oh, I don't have any batteries back here. Oh, it's working? Okay. It'll probably drop out again. Hey, Gabe, could you, or one of the sound, would you mind going into the office? And in the closet, there's some AA batteries, just in case. I need 2 of them, just in case it does drop out. So anyway, we're back here with the potter. Not with the batteries, with the potter. So we're back here with the potter. And we've given him the clay. He's protecting it, keeping it moist, keeping it from drying out, and making sure it doesn't get too moist. He's protected it. And let's say you come back a few days later, maybe a week or 2 later, and you go and did he steward? Was he a good steward of the clay? Was he? Sort of. Yeah, he kept it safe. It's still the same nice lump of clay that you gave him. But in a sense, he really wasn't a good steward, was he? Because what did you expect to come back to? Probably a beautiful piece of art. You wanted to come back and see something that was made with that clay. And in a similar way, that's what we mean by stewardship. We might call it creative stewardship. That is, that God put us into the garden, put us into this world to create. But he did it in such a way that we would create as representatives of him, and that we would do it in a manner that would give him glory. So what does this have to do with work? What does it have to do with work? If you ask most Christians where in the Bible it first talks about work, where do you think most people would go? Most people would probably go to Genesis chapter 3. They would say, "By the sweat of the brow will you provide food." They would go to the fall in Genesis chapter 3. Work doesn't start in chapter 3. It starts in chapter 1. And what happens at the end of God's creation? Everything is good. In fact, it's very good. Which means that there is inherent goodness and dignity in our work. Inherent goodness, inherent dignity in our work. In all of our work. I don't just mean what you go to the office and do. I mean, if you're a grandparent, that's work. If you're a mother or a father, that's work. If you are volunteering somewhere, that's work. All work has dignity. Why? Because of this, it's an extension of God's creation. He put us here to create. It's an extension of God's creation. So, let me ask you this. Does God provide for us? Does he provide for us? Yeah, Scripture says he provides for us. But what is the typical way that he provides for us? Well, it's the farmer who tills his field. It's the man who drives the truck to deliver the food to the market. It's the market owner. It's the employees of the market owner. It's the lady at the checkout counter who exchanges the food to the farmer so that it becomes our food. God provides for us. It's the typical way that it happens. Does God protect us? What's the answer? You know the answer. Does he protect us? Yes. Yeah. These are not trick questions. He does protect us. He protects us, but how does he usually protect us? He does it through a police force. He does it through judges. He does it through a criminal justice system. I'm not saying that these things are perfect, but when they're operating the way that God designed them to, they are indeed an extension of his created work. All of our work has goodness and dignity because in some way, God's work is being done through our work. Somebody is benefiting. Someone is benefiting from that product. Someone is benefiting from that service. Somehow that work is God's work when it's being done rightly. Now, for the wise of you, yes, there are some exceptions. Thieves do not count. But so, the skeptic among us. So let me see if I can figure out what's going on here. So anyway, all work has dignity and goodness. Now, you might be asking yourself, well, you know what? Why don't I feel that goodness and dignity? I mean, are there times in your job where you just feel like this is drudgerous? This is dreary. This is distressing. I don't really like this. So how can all work have dignity and goodness if at times I feel so anxious, tired, weary, exhausted, dismayed? Not all the time, but from time to time, why do I feel that way if there's such goodness and dignity to our work? Well, now we have to go to the next part of the story. And this occurs in Genesis chapter 3. So you know what happens in Genesis chapter 3. Adam and Eve have been tempted by the serpent. There's this tree. God said it's not a good idea if you eat from this tree of the knowledge of good and evil that's in the middle of the garden. It's not a good idea. Don't take from it. And the serpent comes along. And how does the serpent entice Eve and Adam to partake of the fruit? How does he do it? How does he do it? In chapter 3, verse 5, it says this: when the woman saw the fruit of the tree was good for food and pleasing to the eye and also desirable for gaining wisdom, she took some and ate it. Actually, I just read verse 6. I meant to read verse 5. For God knows, verse 5, for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. To be an image of God doesn't mean to be the originator or the original. It doesn't mean that. But somehow the serpent managed to plant into the soul of Eve and Adam this discontentment with the place that he had placed them. They said, you know what, it's not good enough for us just to be the image. We want to be like God. We want to be equal with God. They said, you know what, let us form our little labor union, albeit a corrupt labor union. Let us form our little labor union. We're going on strike against God. He told us not to take this, but we're going to go do it. It wasn't just breaking an arbitrary rule. It was actually trespassing a limit that was set there for their goodness and their protection. And from that, evil proliferated all over the world. And it worked its way into every sector of our society and every place of our lives. The results were this. Cain, what does he do? He kills his brother Abel in regard to his work. When they were building the Tower of Babel, they didn't say, let us build a tower in the name of God. They said, no, let us build a tower to make a name for ourselves. And what does God say? He says, first he curses the serpent, but then in verse 17, if you go down a little bit in the middle of verse 17, it says, cursed is the ground because of you. Through painful toil, you will eat of it all the days of your life. It was supposed to be good. It was supposed to be easy to get fruit from the ground. Now it was going to be difficult because sin had proliferated. It would affect every area of their life. And not just that, but if you go a little bit before that, in verse 16, he says to the woman, I will greatly increase your pains in childbearing. With pain you will give birth to children. Your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you. Childbearing's work, right? Yeah, it's work. Tilling the field, that's work. All of it became difficult because sin had entered the world. All of it. And what does God do? At the end of chapter 3, what does he do? He exiles them from the garden. Because it's not good for them to stay there. Otherwise, they will take from the tree of life and they'll live forever. Why would God not want them to live forever? Why would he not want that? You know, when I was doing youth ministry in one of our small groups, the idea of heaven came up. And there was this 14-year-old girl who had a really terrible family life. It was very hard. Her parents just didn't take very good care of her. Her life was just rough. And she came up to me after youth group and she said, I don't want to go to heaven because I don't want to have to live for eternity. I don't want this for eternity. If this is life, I don't want eternity of this. And I can't actually remember what I said to her, and I can't even remember if it satisfied her curiosity. And because I can't remember, it kind of leads me to think that maybe I didn't give a really good answer, and maybe it didn't satisfy her. But I wish I would have said, but it's so much better. It's so much better. It's everything in this life that you love orchestrated perfectly. And it goes on forever. God knew that he didn't want us to be miserable forever. To have the capacity to sin and to have the capacity to live forever would not have been a very good thing for Adam and Eve. So he exiled them from the garden. And what does exile mean? Well, it means to always be longing to go home. It means to always be restless, to always be exhausted. And so it is in our toil on one hand, our toil and all of our labor, it seems so difficult because it doesn't come easy. It comes so hard. And our relationships are broken, and the people that we work with, it's just not always harmonious. It's hard because sin has entered it. And then there's a part of us that wants to dismay and just go, it's not worth it. Why do I do this? Why do I subject myself to this every day? It's not worth it, and we want to dismay. But on the other hand, because sin kind of turns us inward, because we want to not just be in the image, we want to be like God, we make work about us. So we say, you know what, the reason I do this is so that I can be a great person. It's not about those who benefit from what I'm doing. It's not about all the benefits that others receive or the way that God's working through me. It's about me building up myself, me building my resume, me making a career for myself, and it becomes about me. Now, what happens when work becomes about you? Well, your identity becomes so attached to your work, you can't pull it away from it. And when things are going really good at work, you kind of feel euphoric. This is great. Oh, things are going so great. I love life. But then when things get a little bit rough and a little bit bad, because your identity is so wrapped up to it, you go, oh, my life's terrible. Why won't things work right? And if things get really bad, we might even contemplate suicide because our identity is so much about us, when all along it was supposed to be about glorifying God. All right, so work is good, it has dignity, but it's toilsomely broken. What do? Do we just put our hand to the plow and let things be the way they are? Is there a solution? Is there an answer? Well, I think there is. And the first step of that answer is to understand that we need help outside of ourselves. You know what, if I have a little cold or something, like, okay, my body might be able to handle it, my immune system might kick in. But if I get really, really sick, if I get like HIV, if I get Ebola, if I get something that's just going to destroy my body, and I say, you know what, I can fix this myself. If I just change my diet, if I just do things a little different, I can fix this, what'll happen? Eventually I'll die. But if I go to a doctor and they do some medical intervention, you know what? I might survive. I need help from outside of myself. I can't help myself. My body can't help myself. I need help from someone else. Who can I turn to? Do you remember what the symbol of the curse of our work is? Thorns and thistles. What did Jesus wear on his head when he was crucified? A crown of thorns. He became exiled from the Father. My God, why have you forsaken me? So that I might be brought home. He became restless. The foxes have holes, the birds have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head, so that I can have rest, deep, abiding rest. And the same Jesus Christ comes to us and says, come to me, all you who are weak and weary, and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and I will give you rest for your soul. We sometimes think of redemption as just about getting to heaven. You know, it's just redeeming us just enough so that we can get there someday. But our redemption is about so much more. It redeems every facet of our life, including our work. And the way that we reclaim that goodness and dignity of our work is to look to him who wore the crown of thorns, so that someday the ground will no longer produce thorns and thistles for us. It changes everything. So here's my assignment for you. Today, tomorrow, take 5 minutes with a piece of paper, maybe an index card. What is the story that you tell yourself in regard to your work? When you walk into the office, when you open the locker, when you turn the key on the tractor, when you meet with that client, whatever it is, what is the story that you tell yourself in regard to your work? Who are you benefiting? How are you benefiting them? And how is your work connected to God's work? That's your assignment.